The studio lights burned brightly, drowning the stage in artificial warmth while the audience applauded on cue. Denzel Washington stood at the center, his signature poise undisturbed. Behind the camera's view, however, the tension simmered. A young black usher had just been quietly redirected by the white floor manager, her subtle act of dismissal buried under production chatter. Denzel noticed it, not with words, but with the faint narrowing of his eyes. The moment was small, invisible to most, but unmistakable to him. As the host introduced him as a living legend untouched by the chaos of the world, Denzel's expression stayed composed. But within, something unsettled turned. The host continued with polished ease, speaking of inspiration, legacy, and dignity, each word bouncing off the surface like a pebble on water. Then, mid-sentence, a monitor on the side stage flickered to life with a signal that no one had prepared. 4. The control room froze. Caller ID. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, Ouagadougou. The audience laughed, mistaking it for a tech glitch. But Denzel didn't move. His fingers gripped the edges of his award. His jaw tightened ever so slightly. In that flicker of stillness, a history unspoken began pushing its way to the surface. The host leaned in, trying to pivot with charm. "Unbreakable, aren't you, Denzel?" he quipped. Denzel turned his eyes slowly toward the camera and answered in a low voice, "Grace is learned in the fire." The call hadn't even started, but the air had already changed. A producer's voice stammered in someone's earpiece. Fingers hovered near mute buttons, but the moment had already breached containment. Somewhere off-screen, a technician hesitated. And in that hesitation, the truth prepared to enter uninvited. Just 48 hours earlier, in a sun-baked press pit in West Africa, journalists had swarmed to capture a fiery address by Captain Ibrahim Traoré. The Western media quickly labeled him as a young disruptor, a militant dreamer, packaging him for public dismissal. But across the ocean, in a modest home office filled with old film scripts and stacks of letters from fans, Denzel watched in silence. He had received a handwritten note just days before from a student in Burkina Faso who'd been admitted into an African film academy funded in Denzel's name, an initiative born of Ibrahim's directive. The letter's final line read, "Your role showed me how to stand before I knew how to speak." Behind the studio's glitz and the applause rehearsed for the teleprompter, Denzel carried stories like that letter quietly. When Ibrahim's aide first called the network, suggesting a brief on-air thank you from the captain, executives dismissed it immediately. "It's a security risk," one email read. Another was more blunt. "Our core audience doesn't follow African politics. They won't connect." The request was buried. But then the footage of a scholarship ceremony in Ouagadougou surfaced online. Children in dusty uniforms chanting scenes from Glory, a building under construction with DWIT Academy etched in stone. The clip went viral. Hashtags like Africa Speaks and Denzel Listens began to trend globally. Sponsors wavered. A late-night journalist caught wind of the story and whispered backstage before the ceremony, "They're scared this becomes bigger than you." Bigger than them. Denzel only nodded. He'd seen it before, the quiet violence of institutional censorship. Back at the studio, panic simmered behind the scenes. Producers argued whether they should allow the call at all. "If we block it now, it'll look worse," one muttered. Another snapped, "Let him speak, just don't let him take over the show." In the green room, Denzel sat alone. He thought of the young usher, of the student's letter, of the times he'd spoken softly when the world needed fire. Traoré's aide called again. "Captain will keep it brief. He only wants to honor the man who reminded him that black dignity isn't cinematic, it's lived." The host was told to introduce it lightly, play it off. But when the screen split, Denzel on stage, Traoré framed in golden African dusk. The game changed. Traoré didn't offer platitudes. He began with conviction. Brother Denzel, you once said, ease is a greater threat to progress than hardship. Our children learn in ruins, but they learn because of what you stood for. The control room fumbled. Cut the call, a voice barked, but the system glitched. The audio held. Denzel responded with a quiet intensity. I acted revolutions, you lead one. Behind him, the audience sat motionless. The host tried to interject, but Traoré spoke again. The world thinks we rebel, but rebels built nations. If they silence us now, they silence what you inspired. Truth without apology. Denzel's lips parted slightly. His voice cracked. I believed stories could shape hearts. You showed they can shape borders. Then came a silence deeper than applause. Traoré bowed his head on screen, and the feed cut without warning. The audience didn't move. It wasn't technical. It was reverence. The next morning, chaos unfolded in the sanitized corporate world that once choreographed applause. News outlets exploded with takes. Some painted Denzel as reckless, others praised him as a bridge between continents. Network executives issued a measured statement, calling it an unscripted moment with unintended implications. But the damage to their carefully constructed wall had already been done. In a classroom in Brooklyn, a teacher replayed the clip. A young student, perhaps not older than 10, leaned forward and whispered. He cried because someone finally said thank you. On social media, the moment bloomed, not as controversy, but as clarity. Old interviews resurfaced. Denzel's decades of quiet support for underserved communities were no longer footnotes. They were the frame. Studio partners pulled ad campaigns. The host of the show, once a polished media favorite, found herself quietly sidelined in future programming decisions. No memo was sent. Just silence. The floor manager, who had redirected the usher, was reassigned to storage logistics. He noticed, bitterly, that no one joined him for lunch that week. Across the world, in Burkina Faso, children gathered near the cement foundation of the DWIT Academy. A small banner had been added beneath the name for those who never needed permission to be seen. When a local journalist asked Traoré what he hoped Denzel would do next, he answered simply, nothing. He's already done enough. A week later, back in the now empty studio, Denzel recorded a personal PSA in a single take. If telling the truth costs airtime, I'll pay in silence, but I won't pay with my soul. The network debated airing it. They aired it after midnight. Still, millions watched. At a modest neighborhood cafe, the young usher sipped coffee with the reassigned journalist who had warned Denzel backstage. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. In their silence lived the weight of everything said. In Harlem, a mural of Denzel and Traoré began taking shape on a brick wall. Denzel in grayscale, Traoré in bold ochre, a single quote between them. Different stages, same light. Across the bottom, in hand-drawn letters, legacy is not what you leave behind. It's who you lift while you're still here. Though the studio tried to reclaim its narrative with a well-produced, behind-the-scenes feature, the audience had moved on. The internet had already archived the raw truth, the look in Denzel's eyes, the quiver in his voice, the silence that followed. A silence louder than applause. The last words of the muralist, captured in a local news clip, echoed across timelines. They wanted a tribute. What they got was a reckoning. And just like that, history tilted, not through riots or speeches, but through a phone call that should have never made it to air. And a tear that told the world some truths don't need permission. They just need to be heard.